would like to welcome Professor Harriet Deacon and Anindita Patra, who will be also helping Harriet in this session. Since I have a lot of background noise coming in, I would request Bharvi to get us started. And welcome to all the participants as well. Thank you.
So all those who attended the ICH World Forum must have heard Professor Harriet Deakin. Dr. Harriet Deakin is an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She has a PhD in history and an MSc in Management of Intellectual Property Law. She has published widely in the fields of heritage, law, health, and culture. She is a member of UNESCO Facilitators Network for the Global Capacity Building Program of the 2003 convention and has worked in over 20 countries. Since 2018, she has worked in projects funded by the British Academy and the British Council to develop heritage sensitive intellectual property and marketing strategies, that is HiPAMS, with bearer communities in India and Kyrgyzstan. This work aims to explore the connections between intangible heritage and sustainable development and is also the topic for today. So Professor Harriet Deakin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bharvi. It's a great honor to be here with you all today. And my colleague Anindita Patra is joining me today. So I'd really like, Anindita, can you introduce yourself? Because I know there have been some recent changes, and tell us also about your PhD.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anindita Patra. I've completed my MPhil in International Relations with specialization in Community Studies from Jadavpur University, Kolkata. For the last 4 years, I've been working as a research and content development consultant with banglanatak.com. But right now I'm working as an independent researcher and I'm planning to complete, or rather start, my thesis and PhD on say branding of crafts. Like, I can only give you like a brief idea about what I'm planning to work on. Hello, everyone, and hope we have like a very engaging and interactive session today.
Thanks, Anindita. Anindita and I have been working together on the HiPAMS project, on heritage-sensitive marketing and intellectual property strategies. So that's why we're presenting together today. So it's very nice to meet you all. Please turn on your video if you do have a video capability. And it would be, I think, very useful to get a sense of how many people were able to attend the World Forum session on HiPAMS that I presented, because I know there were quite a lot of sessions and maybe you didn't get to attend all of them. And it affects then what I say in the session. I can always recap what I presented at the World Forum, but if you all were there, then we can skip over some of that content. So Bharvi, could you run the poll, please? It's completely anonymous, so please be frank. And if you didn't attend, then I'll just recap what I said there, or if you can't remember what happened in it. Okay, I think we can close the poll if everyone's voted. And maybe share the results so I can see. Okay, so a bit of a mix. Okay, so I will recap a bit what I covered there, and hopefully people attended some of the other sessions as well. What I'd like to do. Morning, everybody. What I'd like to do now is to have a little bit of a discussion about what you felt came. I know you've already had a recap of the World Forum, but I was just wondering whether people had any comments or questions about the discussion on commercialization in the World Forum that you feel it would be particularly relevant to today's discussion on marketing and intellectual property strategies.
Hello.
Hi. Yes, please share. Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was one of my best presentations in the ICH forum. I think mostly because it seemed very practical and very rooted to the ground, because like many comments yesterday, using so much of technology seems quite scary for ICH, because ICH is very community driven, human driven, and the use of technology somehow doesn't feel very comfortable. Actually, I was just thinking, because the ICH is practiced for the community, for their for the purpose of their rituals, or need not be religious, but social practices, etc. And then at current times, when we have to look at the marketing side as well, it feels a little disturbing, because why should the ICH be practiced for the market? It is supposed to be for the community, for their social and spiritual and whatever benefits that that it's supposed to bring. But then again, when I was reflecting back after your presentation, I realized that right now sustainability, times are not like before, and sustainability is very important. So it gave me a mixed kind of a thought of how how we should. Of course, you gave a lot of strategies to move forward, maintaining they say not to use the word authenticity right anymore in ICH. So maintaining the past social practices, yet adapting to present times and situations and technology. So it was a very mixed thought, and I really appreciated your presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I suppose you're putting your finger on it, isn't it? It's that tension between how do you manage that market interaction from a community point of view, and it is tricky. And I think that all of those factors do come into play. And Anandita is going to talk about it a little bit, but what we tried to do in the HiPAMS project was to give community members, the more control over the use of digital technologies. But it is a challenge, and I think these are not easy. These are not easy questions. Like there's no golden ticket.
Yeah, true. And also to think about how technology savvy are these communities, and even and not only about being savvy, but how much of connectivity to technology do they have?
Yeah, the digital divide issue. I mean, Anandita, do you want to comment on the digital divide thing a bit? Because I think that's quite fundamental to our later discussion.
Yes. So I agree that digital divide is there, and not like, first of all, the most of the artists, they do not have smartphones, and they do not know how to use them. And then there are also rural places where there are no internet connectivity. Even if they want to use one, they do not. They are unable to use. So while working on the HiPAMS project in the rural parts of West Bengal, what we did is we identified community members who are very tech savvy, who are young, and we focused on collective marketing through them. Like, instead of individually, like if there are 100 artists in a community, instead of asking each and every artist to use a smartphone and to tell their stories digitally, or to sell their products through Facebook, we identified young members in the community who could do it for the rest. Like, if we identified 10 members in a community, those 10 young members could like form their own groups and help the artists who are not very tech savvy, or the older and senior artists. So that is how we approached, because we always have to keep this in mind, that not everybody will be very comfortable, because we also faced questions like, I am an artist, I want to be involved in just making my art. I don't want to get involved in marketing and branding. So it was very important to make them understand that why marketing and branding of their art form is important. They would always say that, madam, we are just artists. We want to paint, we want to sing. We don't want to get into all these complications. So of course, mobilization and sensitization was the first step. I won't say it was easy. It took time, but when one artist did well through digital storytelling or by selling their products digitally, or say conducting online workshops during the pandemic, that is when they realize that, wow, this is a good way. So we just have to find initially that one or two people who will be very much interested, and then they will take the digital path. And the rest of the members of the community, when they see that, like when I'll be sharing my PPT, I'll share a story that when they'll find that, okay, like through digital storytelling or through marketing or branding, these artists are reaching out to a lot more customers, then the rest of the community will be inspired to follow the path. So like there is sensitization and mobilization, there is identifying young people in the community will be able to help the other artists. And it's important to also identify those people who will lead the way for digital storytelling or branding or marketing. Because if, like I said, if two people are successful, the rest of the community will think twice that, okay, so this can be a way of doing business.
Yeah, thanks, Anindita. I think that's very practical and useful insights for everyone. Kamal has asked, is there a benefit sharing mechanism? And I remember this issue came up in the YouTube chat also during the World Forum. We had quite a lot of discussions about the link between the community marketing or sort of collective marketing and individual marketing. And so we had some strategies that were helping individual artists, as Anindita says, getting their own stories up. But then there's also a website where we had some collective marketing strategies. Kamal, I don't know if you're asking about benefit sharing more broadly. Where are you? I can't see you on my screen. Do you want to frame your question a little bit? Because there's also kind of benefit sharing possibilities where you've got a third party commercial organization involved. And I think for me, the World Forum sessions that I listened to raised quite a lot of questions about what do you do if there's a third party, a big company involved in the process, because that wasn't the case for our project, but I would imagine there are many cases like that. So Kamal, were you talking about a separate company?
Thank you very much. I'm Kamal from Nepal, and I'm a biologist, and I also belong to the indigenous peoples. I follow the CBD, and I was asking the question in the
about
forum.
Nagoya. Yes.
Same. And because of this, the arts or all the things that are related to the peoples and their society, also it is their lifestyle, and also it is the identity for them. And sometimes we discuss within our group how we to protect.
Yes.
And because of the today is the when we talk about the marketing and also business purpose, and there are a lot of you say it is a risk and challenge, and also it is a tricky because there are many misappropriation, and some of the things is going in outside, and the benefits the peoples are not getting back. So
that's right.
If there is a possible to help us the mechanism to the benefit sharing when we talking about the business or marketing purpose, that was our the discussion, and I reflected as the in the forum for you.
Yes, thank you.
That's my concern, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamal. I think it's a very good question. It's not something in the HiPAMS project, it's not something that we really discussed because there wasn't a third party making money. We're just helping the artists to make money out of their art. Obviously, there were galleries and other parties involved where we had an ethical program that we'll talk, an ethical guideline that we'll talk about. But under the Convention on Biological Diversity, what Kamal was asking about and talking about is a special protocol called the Nagoya Protocol. And that is where you have genetic resources that are being used that have traditional knowledge associated with them. For example, if you have a plant that's used for medicinal purposes, and the community have discovered that it's useful for a particular medicinal purpose, and then a company comes along, learns about this medicinal use from the community, and then makes a tablet or a medication out of it, that that is then commercially viable for the company, they have to sign some sort of a benefit sharing arrangement with the community under the Nagoya Protocol. There are examples of that working, but the practicalities of it often differ from community to community. So that's not something that we're really going to talk about today, but there are mechanisms under the CBD for that, and assistance to communities for that. Another question is, does the state party have a role in the HiPAMS project? We're not going to talk about the geographical indication in any great detail, but a geographical indication is a kind of intellectual property right that is basically set up with state assistance, usually in most countries. It's a kind of public-private right where it's like Darjeeling tea or some sort of other regional product that is linked to a particular part of the country. And so I would say the government was fairly involved in helping to set up this GI scheme across India. And in the HiPAMS project, there were 2 different geographical indications for 2 of the communities that we were helping them to use most effectively. But the project wasn't funded by government as a research project. Okay, so thanks everyone for all their comments. I think the World Forum raised quite a lot of issues around commercialization of ICH, and hopefully we can discuss them in more detail during the course of today's session. And I would particularly like your thoughts later on about the role of technology. I think we've already started talking about that from Swati's comment, the role of technology and what are the possibilities and risks of perhaps taking the next step. We talk about giving people more digital skills, getting people to market their own stuff online. But what about the next step with artificial intelligence? What kind of implications might that have for an artistic community like the ones we've been working with? So I'd really like us to start thinking about some of those future-proofing issues as well. Please, if you've got other thoughts or questions, pop them in the chat. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to give a little bit of an intro to HiPAMS for those who didn't listen to the sessions in the World Forum. And then we're going to show a video and continue with the presentation. So I'll just share my screen now. So HiPAMS is heritage-sensitive marketing and intellectual property strategies. And essentially the project arose out of this debate about how does intangible heritage safeguarding relate to sustainable development. And as you probably saw in the World Forum debates, there's quite a lot of talk about ICH as a resource for the cultural and creative industries. In other words, it's kind of historical research and development that's done at a community level, and then it's being kind of harvested by the cultural and creative industries. And at the same time, communities of artists are also needing to earn money from their own ICH. So these two dynamics of the artists themselves needing to make money from their cultural practices, sometimes that's always been the case. They've always earned money from them. And then also there's this issue of the third party, the commercial enterprises, also wanting to make money, and also people being inspired by ICH. So there are many ways in which intangible heritage can be a resource for sustainable development. But at the same time, there's not so much discussion about how this kind of market interaction then feeds back into the artist communities in terms of sustaining long-term innovation and growth, and also in terms of livelihoods. So the HiPAMS project really tried to look at this conundrum, like how do you think about this interaction with the market? On the one hand, there are these risks of exploitation or maybe damage to the heritage. And on the other hand, there's this potential benefit, and how do you maximize the benefits and minimize the risks? So the HiPAMS India project, particularly we'll be talking about today, there's a website, hipamsindia.org, if you want to go and have a look. And we'll soon have also a new document repository, hipams.org, for both the Kyrgyzstan and the India projects. The HiPAMS India project has just finished this year, and it was an academic project involving an NGO, banglanatak.com, as well as some academics from Europe and 3 different communities. So I will just share the video now.
নমস্কার, আমার নাম সুমন চিত্রকর। আমি একজন পটচিত্র ওনারা কিন্তু আমার থেকে কোনো অনুমতি নেয়নি বা জিজ্ঞেস করেনি যে আমরা এটা নিয়ে ক্যালেন্ডার করবো কি কিছু। তো এটা আমার পক্ষে খারাপ হয়েছে।
The film credits the name of my dance group or my name was not mentioned.
বহু জায়গায় দেখেছি আমার অ্যাড দেওয়া, আমি প্রোগ্রামে যাইনি, সেই প্রোগ্রামে গিয়ে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে আমার ছবিটাই লাগানো আছে, অন্যজন প্রোগ্রাম করছে।
Same skill, different performances. More Bollywood, more Bollywood. It's important.
মাটি, শিকড়টা নিচে আছে মাটি, তারপর শিকড় বিস্তার করেছে, তারপর আছে একটা কাণ্ড, তারপর তার ডালপালা গিয়ে বিস্তার করেছে লতা পাতা ফুল ফল। এই ফুল ফলগুলা এই শিল্পী খুব সুন্দর।
So what copyright does is to give you the right to say, this is mine.
All ways of sharing your designs amongst each other. Maybe you start start having a discussion about it.
সোনা সোনা সর্বজন হাও সবে সাবধান পটুয়ারা এত বোকা নয় গো পটুয়ারা এত বোকা নয়
What is marketing? This is a product. This is a product. Marketing is magic. But last time I didn't buy because this is the packaging.
They are very much into networks, okay? So my daughter, what she does, I give her the scroll, I give her your video of the singing. The first thing my daughter does is share with all the friends, Instagram, Facebook, all that.
পটের শিকড়টা আগে গল্প, সেই গল্পের উপর একটা গান আছে, সেই গান তার উপর ছবি, এইগুলোর একটা প্রত্যেকটার সঙ্গে প্রত্যেকটার একটা সম্পর্ক।
আমরা যেমন সোশ্যাল মিডিয়া নিয়ে অনেক কিছু জানতে পেরেছি, ফেসবুক, হোয়াটসঅ্যাপ, ইনস্টাগ্রাম, এইসব বিভিন্ন জিনিস, এবং এগুলা করে আমরা ধরুন প্রচারটাও হচ্ছে, প্লাস আমরা বাইরে থেকে কন্ট্যাক্টও পাচ্ছি।
অনেক কিছুই শিখেছি, যেমন বলতে গেলে আমার নিজের ইউটিউব চ্যানেল আছে, তো কিভাবে ইউটিউব চালাতে হবে, মানে কিভাবে নিজের ভিডিও আপলোড করতে হয় সেসব সম্বন্ধে আমি অতটা জানতাম না। তো এখান থেকে হিপামসের ট্রেনিং থেকে সেটা আমাকে বোঝানো হয়েছে।
উপকৃত বলতে প্রথমে তো আমি মোবাইল চালাতে পারতাম না, সেগুলো নিয়েও এখানে কর্মশালা করা হয়েছে প্রান্তরে। তো সেখান থেকে অনেক কিছু দেখানো হয়েছে, আমাদেরকে হাতে ধরে ধরে শিখিয়ে দেওয়া হয়েছে। সেখান থেকে হোয়াটসঅ্যাপে আমি কাউকে কিছু পাঠাতে পারি, তারপর ফেসবুকে ছবি ছাড়তে পারি, কাউকে কমেন্ট করতে পারি, এগুলো তো আছে। অ্যাটলিস্ট আমাদের যদি পারিশ্রমিক আমরা নাও পাই, কিন্তু আমাদের মানে নাম দিতে হবে, এবং আমরা আগে লাইভ প্রোগ্রাম করতে পারতাম না, এখন আমরা অনেক লাইভ প্রোগ্রাম করছি। আর এই প্রজেক্টটা হয়ে আমরা অনেক সুবিধা পেয়েছি।
এটা আর ফুটেজটা, এটার থেকে আমরা প্যাকেজিংয়ের ব্যাপারে জেনেছি, আর অনেক কিছু জেনেছি, যেমন জিআইয়ের ব্যাপারটা জানা ছিল না, সেটা জেনেছি। আর প্যাকেজিংয়ে আমাদের আরও খুব ভালো হয়েছে জিনিসটা, যে মুখোশটা খারাপ হচ্ছে না।
নাগপুরে একটা ম্যাডামকে আমি দুটো শাড়ি করে দিয়েছি, তো ওটা আমি ওই রিসার্চ সেন্টার থেকেই প্যাকেজ নিয়ে গিয়ে প্যাকেজিং করে পাঠিয়েছিলাম। তো ওটা পাওয়ার পরে বললো যে তোমার তো কাজটাও খুব সুন্দর হয়েছে, সাথে সাথে তুমি যে প্যাকেটটা দিয়েছো তোমাদের পটচিত্র সম্বন্ধে লেখা আছে, দেওয়া আছে, এটা খুবই ভালো জিনিস। তো আমি এটাও গুছিয়ে রাখবো, শাড়িটাও যেমন আমি খুব যত্ন করে রাখবো, প্যাকেটটাও ভালো করে রাখবো।
এই হিপামস ইন্ডিয়াকে আমরা ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি আমাদেরকে এই ধরনের নতুন নতুন প্রজেক্ট, নতুন নতুন পালা, ওয়ার্কশপ করানোর জন্য হিপামস ইন্ডিয়াকে আমি অনেক অনেক থ্যাংক ইউ জানাচ্ছি।
Right, so you can see Anindita actually was crucial in that video, as the credits show. I think it's a kind of quite a useful summary of the project itself, but I want to say a couple of things about the project now. And then we'll open for questions shortly. I'm just going to share my slides again. Okay, so the HiPAMS India project, you've just seen the video. and it's essentially, it was a partnership between the academic academics from 3 different disciplines: legal, marketing, and heritage, and then banglanatak.com and 3 different communities in India. We're going to focus for our case study today on one of the communities, the Patachitra artists or Patuas in Naya village, Pingla, West Bengal, but there were 2 other communities as well, which you saw in the video. And essentially what we tried to do was to bring together these different sets of expertise from an academic point of view on heritage marketing and IP rights to really, I suppose, act as consultants to the NGO and the community and try and help them solve the various problems that they were facing. So you heard at the beginning of the video that they were having some problems with misappropriation. They were having some problems with asserting their rights in the market. And they also wanted to expand their market. They were all the 3 communities were actually trying to make livelihoods out of their intangible heritage already and had been for some time. And they wanted to sort of improve their earnings from that process. The idea was that one can help the community to maximize their benefit and minimize their risks in this environment. And the idea was to have these quite practical strategies so that they could actually implement them. You know, it wasn't a kind of theoretical project in that sense. And something I didn't talk about in the World Forum session because there wasn't time, was in a bit more detail about the actual process that we developed. So the academic side of the project was really designed to reflect on what we were doing in the engagement with the communities and to try and distill from that some, I suppose, some guidelines for how to do it again. And so we broadly had 4 phases of the process: diagnosis, strategy development, strategy implementation, and monitoring and evaluation, all done with the community themselves. You saw in the video that there was a bit of a language barrier between the academics who were all English or Italian speaking and the communities who spoke mainly Bengali, I think, Anindita, but there were some other dialects in there as well, which, you know, from the academic's point of view, we didn't fully get. And so there was a translation process that happened through Anindita and her team at banglanatak.com. So essentially, in the diagnostic process, we really started asking people what problems you're having, how can you know, these problems be addressed, what is the heritage that you want to protect in your safeguarding process, and what kind of challenges and opportunities did you see? And then in the strategy development, what we did was we workshopped some ideas with banglanatak.com, and then we workshopped them with the community as well. So we went through this iterative process of thinking, okay, well, this is one option. Does it work? Could it be feasible? Does a community of artists like that idea? Do they have suggestions? How do we change it? And eventually we got to strategy implementation. Who will do what? How can we assist the community to do some of the things that they've wanted to do? And then monitoring and evaluation. What worked, what didn't work, what tweaks do we need? And essentially, the idea is to do that in collaboration with the communities concerned, because ultimately it's got to be feasible and practical for them to actually implement and to continue with some of the programs. I did discuss the tools in the World Forum session, and what we distilled out of the HiPAMS project was a kind of package of tools. And so these are some of the ones that I'm going to talk about today. In the World Forum session, I only spoke about the heritage tools, but today I'm going to talk very briefly about the marketing and IP tools. And then Anindita is going to talk a bit about the implementation. So the heritage tools, one of the crucial issues in this project was to rethink this, this idea of authenticity. As Swati was saying, the authenticity debate has been very kind of sensitive within the UNESCO context of the 2003 convention, because the idea is you don't want to impose an external judgment of authenticity onto a community and tell them this is the only way that the authentic craft, and if you don't do it like that, you're not doing it right. The anxiety around authenticity in UNESCO is really around that. But of course, communities, you know, decide what do they want to do in their tradition, or how do they want to change it. They decide what they want to tell their children to do or their apprentices to do, and what skills they want to pass on and what they don't. So these heritage tools, the idea of the roots and fruits, you can see here this mask picture is based on a mask by Dharmendra Sutratar, who's a very innovative mask maker from the Cho mask making community in Cherida. And we really like this idea of the tree with the community at the center of it, and reflecting this idea of the heritage roots and fruits. So the roots are what has been passed on over the generations, what you inherit from the previous generation, and the fruits is what you make. Now, some of those things that you make are the products you put on the market. Other things you might decide not to put on the market. But we had this discussion with each community is, what do you think are the roots of your tradition? And how is that reflected in the products? And the idea behind this is to sensitize the discussion around how do we make sure that the things that we put on the market and the things that we create, some of which might not be for the market, continue the tradition in the way that we want to continue it. So how do we, by the things we make, how do we make sure that the tradition continues over time? And if you're going to focus on creating for the market, how do you make sure that the things that you're putting on the market reflect your tradition in the way that you want it to? So we think both about the relationship between skills or knowledge or meaning and products, but we also think about heritage skills repertoire. What is the repertoire of skills that we want to carry on into the future? And this question of how heritage changes over time, how you have innovation, and also how different kinds of traditions relate to each other. These were all really important starting points for the project. Anindita already spoke a little bit about the digital storytelling training and the marketing skills that we tried to put in place, where we saw that there was a bit of a gap in the community, were really focused on helping the artists to tell their own story in a way that showed how the tradition's roots linked to the fruits. So to really reflect on their own kind of heritage story in the digital marketing. And so this idea of digital storytelling, which is really owned by the communities themselves and told by the artists themselves, was very central to the project. And you saw in the video that the artists got quite a lot out of that. And the idea is that you would look at what people know as what your customers know already, and use that as a starting point for then talking about your tradition and what you want them to learn in the market. So we did some research on what is the reputation in the market for the artists of their tradition. Then we did some capacity building, and Anita spoke about that and how she did that. Encouragement of user-generated stories and encouragement of both individual and collective storytelling. So this idea that it's not just about the individual artists, also about all of them working together on collective marketing. And so in the toolkit, we've got a number of different tools for marketing. One is a reputation analysis tool, some ideas for thinking about how do you strategize around what kinds of connections to make with your customers. So where are they at? How much do they know already? So we've got a reputation analysis tool, and we've also got a bit of a discussion about reputation in the market in 3 typical situations where people don't know about your heritage, where they don't know the right things about your heritage, and where they know a lot about your heritage, and there's a very good reputation that you've got for your heritage in the market. And these 3 reputational situations also carry different risks of misappropriation. So as Kamal was saying, you know, what a lot of communities worry about is they worry about their stuff being taken basically and exploited by others. And the risk of that differs depending on how much knowledge there is about your tradition. And so as you get more involved in the market and more successful in the market, the risk of misappropriation also goes up. So I think that was a very important insight from the project that I hadn't thought about sufficiently, I think, before we'd started it. And then the second issue is you have different kinds of customers, and you need to decide, you know, depending on your pricing, where you're going to target your marketing for your different customers. And that's quite important, I think, when we get to the AI issue, because how do you as an individual artist compete with a big company that's you know, scanning all the jade carvings in all the museums in the world and making a new special design? How do you as an individual jade carver position yourself in a market like that? And I think pricing is crucial, like the price of handmade. How do you position yourself where you make handmade valuable? And so we've got a bit of a pricing guideline also in the HiPAMS toolkit. The legal tools that we have in the toolkit for HiPAMS are really, I think, quite minimal at this stage. This is an area where I think we would like to expand, and I'm hoping that the next phase of the HiPAMS process from a global point of view is going to work on the legal tools. But there were basically, the main thing that we looked at was to help communities to look at what legal measures have they got in place already, and how do they manage those legal tools? So 2 of the communities already had geographical indications in place, and you know, how to maximize their use of that. And we used for that an intellectual property mapping tool. If you look at the HiPAMS website, you'll see this in the HiPAMS toolkit. And it's essentially to think, okay, we've got a geographical indication, we've got copyright, all artists have copyright without registration. They also had a logo for their community organization, which they're using a little bit more often now. And they had a craft market logo registered. And so there were some things we did with each of those different kinds of IP rights. But one of the big insights, and this is again what I'm trying to push now with the HiPAMS project, is this idea of what is an appropriate use of IP for a community of artists who doesn't necessarily, people don't have money to go to court. Okay, so you need to use the legal rights in a way that benefits the artists without relying on them going and getting lawyers involved. It's just too expensive. So how do you use the legal tools that you've got in a way that can be appropriate and effective? So we tried a couple of strategies like model contracts for performers. We had ethical guidelines that were based on copyright and other artists' rights. And we had guidelines for artists. You'll see later when Anindita presents that, you know, those are some of the strategies that we used. But it's very much what is appropriate in a particular circumstance, what is workable. And so to summarize all of this, this is a slide I also showed at the World Forum. There are various dimensions of these HiPAMS strategies. On the one hand, you've got to think, what are the skills repertoire in the community that you want to maintain over time? And at the other end of that axis, what is the kind of innovation that is compatible with the tradition? It's not that artists want to stop innovating outside the tradition, but just to think about what kinds of innovation are compatible with the tradition and what are outside the tradition. And it's quite useful for artists to think about that because it frees them up in a way to innovate more within the tradition. And then on the other axis, community empowerment. You know, artists working together as part of a community are much more powerful than working individually. How do you maximize that organization of different artists for a heritage, a related tradition? And some of the areas of community empowerment were creating a website and a collective training and collective action, like the community notices and the art code. And then reputation. How do you build the reputation of the tradition in the community as well as with your customers? And how do you communicate that? So the marketing is really about enhancing reputation in such a way that you can charge an appropriate price. And so we had strategies around all of these different aspects of the HiPAMS canvas. So the next set of the slides is for Anindita, but I'll just stop briefly here for 5 minutes or so of questions if anyone has any questions about the theoretical model of the HiPAMS. Okay, so Lubna says, may I know how many artist communities are now using the HiPAMS mechanism? So Anindita can maybe update me if you're trying it in anywhere else, but we had 3 different communities trialing it out in a project. So I don't know if it's been rolled out anywhere else in India yet. I know Ananya was talking about that.
Yes, so when we started working with 3 communities, the Potachitra artists of Bengal, and show artists, and Baul Fakiri artists of Bengal. So they have been using it, and we have been getting very good results or outcomes from their use. Also, certain aspects of HiPAMS we have tried with other communities as well, like the craft communities of Rajasthan, though we haven't rolled it out like in a formal way through a project or anything, but we have taken aspects from HiPAMS, like digital storytelling, marketing, IP awareness, and we have tried it among the communities of Rajasthan, both performing artists and crafts. So, and we have seen like we have received good outcomes and good response from them too. And we have also we are also planning on using it with other artist communities of Bengal. So let's see how it goes, but we haven't done it with other communities in a formal way, but we have taken like certain aspects, like one size does not fit all, as we know. So we have taken certain aspects of the HiPAMS project and tried it on with other communities as well.
Yeah, thanks, Anandita. We also have a project in Kyrgyzstan with heritage entrepreneurs. So it's not HiPAMS in the same way that we did it in India, but it's using the HiPAMS model to help young heritage entrepreneurs think about their businesses. So it's more focused on individual businesses, but it takes some of the insights from HiPAMS. And then just to answer your second question, yes, the tool is free for use. If you look on the HiPAMS website, maybe Anandita, you can put the address in the chat. It is free for use, and we just ask that you credit the HiPAMS project when you use the PowerPoints, but you can change it and adapt it as you want. And there's also the full evaluation. Kamal, you had a question.
Thank you very much. Very nice project and nice presentation. I think the HiPAMS project in West Bengal can be the model, and we can share, and we can also they exchange something in, because we are in close in a geographical region. So I see the video, the painting, maybe the color they use from the traditional way, because I see in our community also in few years they use the traditional way to make the coloring and using the tools to painting. For me, I think if it is so, it is related to the genetic resources and traditional knowledge. Is it the Nagoya Protocol's application in this work?
Yeah, good question. It's not really applicable because there's not a third-party commercial agency coming in to use the traditional paint techniques. It's just the artists using them. But yes, they are using natural, natural plant sources for their paint colors. So if you had an external company coming in to exploit that, you might have a benefit sharing situation, but it's not in this case. I think the final question there is how do we protect the ICH products that are already out on the market that's not been protected? Any effort that helped tracing of the profit origin? Okay, so that's an interesting question. I think what you're really saying is that because the products are well known and sort of available on the market, other people can copy them. You haven't registered, let's say, a design right. So with a new product, you could register a design right on a new kind of product if you're an artist. But these are all traditional products that are already out there. People are often making, in the case of the Patachitra, people are making new designs all the time. So they have copyright in new designs. If they're making an existing design and just repeating an existing design, then obviously they don't have IP rights in that product. But geographical indications are a very powerful way of protecting the name of a product. And I think that's something that people often don't realize how important that is. If you can say you can only call this product Darjeeling tea if it comes from this part of India, if the tea is grown in this part of India. And the same way, we can only call this Bengal Patachitra if it's made in this part of India. Geographical indications then help you to link the origin of the products back to the way you market it in the market. Okay, and so the name is very important. It doesn't protect the way of making something. Somebody can still make they can copy your style in the market. The style of Bengal Patachitra is not protected by IP. But if you as an artist make a particular scroll and you've made a special new design, you have copyright in that design. And that lasts for quite a long time. It lasts for 50 years after your death. So, these different rights, it's not easy to enforce them, but copyright and geographical indications are quite powerful for the community. Okay, so yeah.
Sorry, just a further add to that question, because
Yes.
I see these beautiful crafts products out in the market, usually often with the furniture shops and whatnot. These are big companies and shops carry product from Nepal, product from India, especially. These are beautiful, and I see the differences between the Indian product. So they must be some sort of, but it only says made in India. So we don't know which part of India carries this kind of tradition in a way. So I'm more worried about really identifying what type of craftsman came from which region. I think as a consumer, it'll be more interesting. We can add more value to know where it's coming from and the story behind it, rather than just beautiful Indian product. And then we just consume it. So I think in a way that just making a storyline and all of that, whoever gets most benefit out of it, whether it's a furniture shop or company or marketer, I think they need to really sell in a way that the part of profit goes back to the community, and then that they'll sell better in that way. No.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think that's part of the storytelling and the marketing around the product. It really does need to link back to the artist and the local community. And the geographical indication helps to do that, because it's a little label, that's a little logo that is linked to that very regional kind of origin. But a lot of that is about marketing, and a lot of it's about what is the relationship between the seller, like the distribution channel issue. So no, but I agree with you. I think that is more meaningful for everybody, the consumer and the artist. Okay, so let's take a last one from Gunjan.
Hello, very, very nice presentation. Even during the World Forum, your presentation was very interesting and very beautiful examples were shared. This is more of a dilemma, I think, when you're talking about, empowering the community. I was just thinking, because there was a case of the bowl singers that you have shown, one of the communities that you looked at. Is there any means of empowering the community without, say, over commercializing the art form? Because so it's really great in terms of the patua artists, because it's already a product. But when you are looking at some things like a performing art or some oral traditions, how do we not turn that into a product? Because we're anyway debating about how we have to be very sensitive towards the arts. So I mean, it's just a dilemma. I mean, is there any was there any thinking done in HiPAMS related to this?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of our kind of core, our core problematic in a way, if I can put it that way. That was our core question. So you put your finger on it, is how can you have an engagement with the market that doesn't just empower communities in a financial sense, but also empowers them to express and to continue doing what they really value. And so that was the idea behind the roots and fruits discussion. Because then in the community, people say, okay, this is really what we value. This is what we want to keep. And this is the kind of innovation that we want to see in the tradition. And this is the kind of, the values in a way that we want to hold on to.
But
I don't know if you, sorry.
If I may add, I mean, specifically again, going back to the Baul singers, the Baul tradition is, as much as I know, it's more about devotion, and there's a spiritual connection to the kind of songs that these fakirs or the singers used to sing. So again, another dilemma. I mean, since this presentation is very interesting. So how much intervention of a heritage professional is required to again empower the art, and like, where do we draw the line? I understand what you're saying, like to put the finger on it, but is maybe if Ananta could also share the field review or something, because I'm just interested to know, because
Yeah, no, I will hand over to Anandita on this, but we had that discussion with the Baal singers, and in a way, what they wanted to do was to separate some of their ritual practice and their devotional practice from earning money from the market in a very specific way. So Anandita can explain more about that, how he handled it. Go ahead.
Good question, Gunjan. So it's like there's commercialization, there's over commercialization, and we tried to balance between the two, because commercialization is not bad. Marketing is not bad. It's over commercialization that is bad. And it's very difficult at times to keep that balance, because it's a thin line. So what we tried to do with the Baul and Fakirs are, we always gave the community the power to decide. It was us who were just suggesting ways, but the ultimate decision was in the hands of the community. Whatever we did, be it the marketing strategies, be it the IP right awareness strategies, everything was in consultation with the communities. How much do they want? What do they want? And how do they want to proceed with what they want? So we always have to keep in mind that we need to involve the community in any sort of intervention that we are doing, because at the end of the day, it's their heritage. It's their heritage. So the Baul singers, as we know, Baul, they have like a spiritual thing about it. They some sort of devotion towards it. So they wanted a balance between the two, because they were like, we want to earn money, because if one does not earn money from any sort of like art or performing arts, it is impossible for them to continue through generations, because then the next generation will take up any other profession and not be a Baul singer, or will not be interested in following the footsteps of their past generation. So commercial income or value is very important, but how much that the community gets to decide, and it's their decision at the end of the day, and we are just there to help, and we are there to handhold, and
No,
it is
and
ultimate.
Beautifully, I mean, the project, the HiPAMS work it's beautiful, so kudos to that. But it was just a dilemma that I thought,
Yeah, we are all like, there's no like black and white to it. It's all gray in this area. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And I think also with the BALs, what we were very focused on is fixing some problems that they identified. Like you saw in the video, that some of the BALs were being used for advertising where they weren't even performing at the event. And they wanted to know how to deal with that. And other singers were being commissioned for an event, but then the people would drop them at the last minute, or they wouldn't pay them. And, you know, and all of that sort of thing. And so a lot of the strategies were around that, actually. Okay, so I think we kind of running a bit late on time. Do people need a break, or should we just keep going? We've got another 20 minutes.
Yeah, we'll have a break after your session, so I think you should continue.
Okay.
We can continue, Harriet. Please proceed.
Okay, thanks, Yanis. So maybe, Anindita, now is a good time for you to do your presentation, and we can take further questions at the end. And I see there are a couple in the chat. We won't miss those.
So I'll start by giving a small introduction to Bengal Potachitra. So Bengal Potachitra is a traditional art form from the Midnapur district of Bengal. The artists are known as Patuas. The village Pingla, which has the maximum number of artists, has about 80 families practicing this traditional art form. And the art form has different aspects to it. It is like a long painting done on a scroll with natural colors. The colors are made from leaves and vegetables and fruits and flowers, whichever is locally available for the artists. And they have a song to every story. So the whole painting has like a story to it, and then the painting is made, and it also has a song. So today I'll be sharing the what in HiPAMS, what implementation was done and how it was done, and like some examples of outcomes. So coming to the next slide, we discussed with the artists, we had like long discussion as to what their problems were and how we can resolve them. So the artists, they said that people would come to their village, because Pingla, if any one of you ever get a chance, please do visit. It's a very beautiful village with paintings everywhere on their walls. It's a tiny village with like paddy fields all around. So people would come to the village. They also have a yearly annual festival, and there would be a lot of tourists, and people would take their pictures, photos of their paintings, and they would like leave, the tourists and the visitors. So the artists, they were not quite happy with it, but they did not know what to do about it. They were unaware of their rights. So the first step that we did was create an awareness, like mobilization and sensitization among the community about what their rights were. That people copying, they were very disappointed with people copying their art forms and their paintings, especially by city dwellers, but they didn't know how to proceed or how to complain or what to do about it. So after the IP awareness workshop or training, they came up with their own Potachitra scrolls, like you can see on the screen. One is on GI and one is on intellectual property rights. So to educate the community, so these people, the Potachitra artists, they have been painting on mythological tales, and their scroll comes in sections. Like one section is like a story. It's like a, you can call it's like a film. Every part of a painting is like a scene of a film. And with time, they moved on to making Potachitra scrolls on modern events and social causes, like the 9/11 incident, the Corona, recent COVID pandemic incident, and also on social issues like importance of education, importance of saving the environment. So they made beautiful scrolls on GI and IP to educate the larger community. After consultation with the community, we came up with with art code, which was created to protect the rights of the artist. So when an artist is interacting with the stakeholders, so they can they can negotiate properly with the stakeholder. So we have made this leaflets. It's just the first page of the art code. I've shared the HiPAMS website where we have the entire art code. So it's like a tiny 4-page leaflet where we have mentioned what the artists want. Like, we want our rights to be protected. We want that you can take our photos, but please mention our names and village. So this helps the artist in interacting with the stakeholders. Coming to the next point, which is digital storytelling. So I would like to emphasize here that it is very important for the artist community to tell their stories. We as outsiders or third parties, we have helped the artists a lot in communication and telling their stories, but it is always the stories told by the artists that appeal to the masses more. And it is very important for them to tell their stories because it gives them a sense of ownership and a sense of control over their own stories, over their own heritage. So we conducted workshops on how they can tell their stories on different platforms. Some might be comfortable on Facebook, some might be comfortable on Instagram, some might be comfortable in YouTube, and some might not be comfortable with any of these platforms. He or she might be comfortable with just a WhatsApp message. So whatever the platform is, we had a detailed discussion with the artist communities and we trained them accordingly. Not everyone was tech savvy, of course, and not everybody wanted to be a part of the digital training. For that, especially the senior artists, for those, we had younger artists helping them out. And we also created a website for collective promotion. The website is, you can check it out. I'll put it in the chat once I'm done with my presentation. It's called bengalpottachitra.com. It has like all the paintings of the artist, the songs of the artist, artist profiles, the contact person, like the contact details of the artist. So if you like a certain painting, you can contact the artist directly through the website because their phone number, email ID is given. The website was a sort of initiative for collective marketing, and individual marketing was done by the artists themselves through digital media. Now, like I said before, that when not everybody will agree to be a part of the digital marketing like workshops and everything. They'll say we are artists and we want to be limited to just painting and selling our products on one-to-one basis. So the whole, I would say the idea or the whole aspect or ways of marketing changed after the pandemic because there were no fairs happening, no exhibitions happening. The artists mainly on through festivals and exhibitions, which every exhibitions and fair, they came to a halt. So the digital way was a very good way to reach out to the customers through different ways, like conducting workshops or selling products online. So I would like to share a small story that when the pandemic started, a senior artist called Swarna Chitrakar, she painted a scroll on the pandemic. Like I said before, that they usually paint on mythological and historical themes, but they also paint on social causes and issues. So she painted a long scroll on pandemic, and she was wondering that what do I do with the scroll, because I won't be able to go to exhibitions to sell this scroll, neither can people come to my village to see my scroll or to listen to the song that I have composed on the scroll. So she was reminded of all the digital workshops that we had taken before, and she asked her daughter that, why don't you take a video of me singing and unfurling the scroll that I've made. And her daughter did it, and that video went up on social media website and received around 1 million views within a week. And she was contacted by different newspaper. Her article, like her painting, was featured on different national newspapers like Times of India and Telegraph. It was also featured on the UNESCO website, and she got a huge order from Tara Books to paint a book on pandemic, for which she had to contribute like 100 small paintings.
So this story was an example for the rest of the community to follow the digital path. They thought that, Swarna had put up a video of the scroll painting and she received such a huge order, and she's receiving orders for making similar paintings as well. So why don't we try it out as well? So the entire 80% of the community got engaged on digital platforms. They started selling their products online. Of course, there was hand holding from our side. They started selling their products on Facebook Live, which was a huge success. And many of the artists started conducting workshops, Potachitra workshops to school children, to college goers through online mediums. And recently they're teaching students from Chicago every week through a program called Wonder. So they were very glad and happy that they had gone through the digital training, and that had helped them survive the pandemic by earning through these digital online platforms. Coming to heritage sensitive marketing, QR codes and labels. So like I said before, marketing is magic, like we all know, but we have to keep in mind the balance between over commercialization and commercialization. So we always would like to focus on heritage sensitive marketing. And I would like to give a small example through of heritage sensitive marketing. So like I said, Potachitra scrolls come with a song. So every Potachitra has a story behind it and a song behind it. So when a person is buying a scroll from the painter, he or she is unaware of the story behind it. Maybe the artist is narrating the story, but suppose I am buying a Potachitra scroll, I am a normal buyer, client, customer, whatever, and I'm gifting it to somebody. That person is putting up the picture on the wall, the painting on the wall, but is unaware of the story or the song behind it. So heritage aspects of the art form is getting lost in the way. So we came up with QR codes, like you can see in the picture, like a painting coming with a small tiny QR code. So when a person scans the QR code, he or she is directly taken to the website where one can learn about the tradition, about the art form, about the story behind that particular painting, and also the song. Like there are videos uploaded for every song and they can hear the song. So the QR code has helped in not only creating awareness about the art form, but it creates additional value for the customer. And like you can see here, we've also come up with small tags which mentions about the GI. Like Jung Kim said a while back that people are interested to know where this art form is from. So if a Potachitra is taken to Nepal and the seller says that this is from India, the buyer will be interested to know which part of India, where in India, and who are the artists, where is the village. So we've come up with little tags which mentions about the art form, about the GI tag. So these are like small ways, but very helpful and major ways in marketing the products in a heritage sensitive way, in creating awareness about the art form, in sensitizing people about the artist, the village, the different heritage attributes of the art form. Coming to packaging. So we think that packaging are just cardboard boxes, but it is not. I think packaging is like a silent salesman. It tells a lot without just saying a lot. So it adds additional value. Like you can see in the picture, we came up with boxes for the Potachitra products. Initially, the artists would wrap the long scrolls in newspaper. They would wrap the products like a scroll is an expensive product, but they would wrap it in an old newspaper, or the products in an old newspaper. So the customer is just buying, or when they're gifting it to somebody, the value of the product is lost. So packaging is a very good way of marketing and also creating awareness, because as you can see, the boxes, I don't know whether it's clearly visible, but the boxes have the stories of the artist written on them. What is Potachitra, where the village is, and the other information. The website is mentioned. So if somebody is interested to know more, they can just visit the website and come to know a lot about about the art form. So we see that a simple cardboard box can be a great communication and awareness creating medium. So we've also got feedback from the customers. So the show artist had sent their products, and the Potachitra artist had sent their products to different clients to in the boxes, and they've received very good feedback, saying that they were unaware that show mask of Purulia has GI. So they came to know about it. A client from Bhopal had told the Potachitra artist that I'm going to keep the Potachitra painted garment, but I'm also going to keep the box because it's so beautiful. So creating new packaging has been a huge success in this project. Going to the next point, which is visitor right awareness and marketing. So like I said, the Potachitra village conducts their annual festival every year called the Potmaya, and it gets around 20,000, 25,000 visitors. So we took the opportunity to create awareness through the festival. So during the festival, at all major places like the resource center, like the entrance, we put up these boards like you can see. It was a promotional strategy that we are promoting through websites, through social media. The artists are promoting through their own social media pages, but why not involve the stakeholders also in promotion, right? So it will, like, there's nothing called too much promotion. Like, so we involve the stakeholders in promoting. How we put up these boards in every corner of the festival, saying that please take pictures of the artists and their artwork, of course with permission. And while you are putting up these photos and videos on Facebook and Instagram, please mention the name of the village, the artist, and the festival. So what happened is, people, when they took pictures and they took videos after the festival, we conducted a sort of a social media evaluation, and we saw that this happened in 2020. Yeah, no, sorry, 2019, before the pandemic. So we saw that from 2018 to 2019, the engagement of the audience has increased a lot because of these hashtags. Because people have, initially what would happen, people would take photos and just put up. But after this initiative of ours, we have seen that they're using the hashtag Spot Maya Bengal Potachitra. So when you search Bengal Potachitra on Instagram, you'll see people have tagged artists and the village pictures with this. And this not only created added to the marketing value, but also created awareness about the about the rights of the artist, because it says that please, of course, take pictures. What happens if you take pictures and distribute it on social media? It helps in marketing of the artist, but also mentioning the name of the artist and name of the village helps in creating awareness about the artist's rights. Coming to the last part, which is the promotion of Bengal Potachitra with the help of influencers, I would like to share a small video before I talk on this. So I'll stop my screen sharing and I'll just share the video. Just a second. I hope my video is visible.
Bengal is rich in culture.
Anandita?
No, it's not visible.
Yeah, your folder is visible, not the video.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Just a second.
Yes, now it's visible.
Okay. It's visible now?
Yes.
I'll just start. Yeah.
Bengal is rich in cultural heritage, be it the Potachitra paintings, the melodious Baul music, or the vibrant Chow dance. Let's begin by acknowledging, respecting, and understanding the traditions behind these art forms. Let's aim to draw inspiration from our indigenous practices and not copy them. As an enthusiast of originality, I request you to give an artist his or her due respect by crediting their work so that an awareness is created and the art is promoted.
share my. Yes. So now I'll be talking about how we involved influencers in promotion of Bengal Potachitra. I just showed a small video made by an influencer. So what is an influencer? Or social media by influencers here, I mean social media influencers. Social media influencers are like people who have a lot of followers on social media and they talk about a particular thing or of their interest. Like there are social media influencers on makeup and beauty, on lifestyle, on travel. So we involved influencers to promote Bengal Potachitra, and I'll be sharing the story on how. So we targeted different sort of influencers. We always have to keep in mind that when we are promoting craft, we should target influencers who promotes craft on their pages and not somebody who talks about makeup or travel or lifestyle. So we got in touch with a few influencers. I will just be sharing 3 examples here. Like the first one you see wearing a red t-shirt. So we wanted to target the younger generation and make Bengal Potachitra or traditional art forms cool to the younger generation. So you know, college goers, they're really interested in wearing hand painted t-shirts. So we contacted this young influencers who promoted that how Potachitra can be used on garments to make it look really fashionable. And then the next one that you see is home decor. So how Potachitra can be used in reviving or like revamping your houses with a traditional touch. And we did this just before one of the big festivals in India, Diwali, and it was a huge success. And the third one is, she's a renowned photographer, art photographer from India called Upahar Vishwas. She talked about the artist rights through her page. She talked about how it is important for photographers to mention the artist's name while they're taking like posting videos or photos of the artist. So we see that it is very important to target the right kind of audience and put out the right message when we are trying to use influencers in promotion. And I would like to give like a small like outcome, share a small outcome of this initiative of working with the influencers. The sale of the artists increased like within 10 days. They started getting phone calls, they started getting messages about saying that I want that particular red t-shirt, or I want that particular poster or tray that I had seen on social media. And we tried to keep the social media promotion very collective in nature. So while mentioning while promoting, we mentioned the name of the artist who had painted the particular t-shirt, but while giving orders, we mention the name of the collective, which is Chitraturu. We don't mention the name of any particular artist because there are hundreds of artists painting the same t-shirt. So when clients contact the collective can distribute the work among the community. So there's profit sharing in a way, because otherwise if we mention the name of one artist or two artists, they'll keep on getting orders. So we mentioned the phone number and name of the collective that the Potachitra artists have. And I would like to mention another example which I missed during while sharing about artist rights is I would like to share an example of a Potachitra artist called Shumon, who like how the negotiating capabilities of the artist has increased over the last few years of our project. Is somebody called Shumon to buy a painting, and Shumon asked him, okay, I will sell you my painting, but what do you need it for? So the customer said, I'm going to print it on candle stands. And Shumon was like, okay, my painting costs 500 rupees, but if you are going to reproduce it on candle stands, I am going to charge a percentage of the profit that you make, or I want a lump sum amount. So this is a great example of how the negotiating capabilities of the artists have increased. They're more aware of their rights and they're asking questions to the stakeholders. Initially, this was not happening, I would say, at this rate. So this is where I would like to end my presentation. And like, if you have any questions or comments, please, you're welcome.
One question was about who manages the website. And indeed, thank you very much for the presentation. who manages the website of the community?
Okay, so the website has been created by the HiPAMS team, and like I said, not every individual in the community is capable enough to handle technological platforms. So some of the young community members, they update the website with new pictures and songs from time to time.
Okay, some other question, please. If there is a couple of minutes, last question. Yes, Kamal, last question from Kamal.
Thank you very much for me this last chance for the question. I think it's very useful and interesting project, and it's also I better to say it's a tradition in collective ways. You say the profit sharing. Is there any ratio or any mechanism that the profit goes to the right person, or maybe is there anything?
Sorry, I was on mute. So by profit sharing, I meant sharing of work and not exactly like sharing of profit. So if there's a collective, the collective distributes the work. If there are big orders, suppose like an order of 5,000, painting of 5,000 t-shirts has come. So the collective distributes the work among the artists, and they keep in mind that the last time such an order came, these people got, and these people did not get a chance. So this time, this set of people gets the chance. So distribution of work, I would say, so that not like a particular artist keeps on getting orders and someone else doesn't. But like I said, there are individual artists who get orders directly, because there are artists in the community who have made a name for themselves, like Shorno Chitrakar or Anwar Chitrakar, and they get orders directly because there are people who wants to own a Shorno Chitrakar piece and or an Anwar Chitrakar piece. So then they contact the artist individually.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Anindinda. And we will be back in 25 minutes. Okay? Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. And thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure and an honor to have been invited to this workshop, to be here with you today and to talk to you about this very interesting and also somewhat tricky topic of ICH and gender. Just to give you a brief introduction again, but just to give you an idea of my background within this topic specifically. So I did my PhD in Japan, as Barbie mentioned, and on the topic of gender dynamics within a certain type of festival in Japan. And before the PhD program, I was working in heritage governance in my home country of Sweden. I was working for the Swedish National Heritage Board. And this was at the time when Sweden had recently ratified the 2003 Convention on ICH. So it was all very new. So Sweden needed to develop a master plan of how to implement this convention in Sweden. So I was part of the working group tasked with developing a master plan for this. So in this working group, we were dealing with how to basically translate the text into practice and how to transform these sometimes lofty goals on the convention into reality. And in this work, there were a number of potential problem areas, and gender was one of these problem areas. So one issue was, of course, what happens if we encounter a practice only by men or only by women, for example. Would that practice still be fit for the convention or not? And even though gender was considered an important issue, it was constantly put on the back burner. So it was a bit of a tricky subject to sum up. And also I was looking for research on this topic in order to advise our work. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find very much on this topic, on the specific topic of gender within ICH. And that is how I got the idea to apply for the PhD program. So that's enough about me. Let me just tell you very briefly about these float festivals, this festival that I was researching for the PhD. Just to give you an idea of what kind of topics came up. So in these float festivals, you have a procession of large, often wheeled carts, floats being paraded around town. And often you have music and other performances taking place on top of these floats. And the deities, the gods, are summoned to temporarily inhabit these floats during the festival. So in that sense, the floats are sacred because this is where the deities temporarily reside. And the festivals are traditionally male, they're only performed by men. And they also, there's this outright rule or restriction called Nyonin Kinsei, which is a customary exclusion of women. And we find the same customary exclusion of women in other traditional practices as well, not only these float festivals. And the underlying idea of, or the logic behind this customary exclusion of women is an underlying idea of blood pollution. So blood from childbirth and menstruation are ascribed or considered to be polluted, unclean. And as such, female bodies are also ascribed an innate uncleanness. So the sacred must be protected from pollution. And nowadays, a lot of the people in the communities are unaware of the concept of blood pollution as the reason for excluding women. So nowadays, it's just a tradition. And that being said, a number of festivals have changed the rules, opening up for women to participate in some roles. And in most cases, it's the role of musician and the role of pulling the ropes of the floats to move them forward that have opened up to women. So in my research, I looked at how and why such changes occur. So today's lecture consists of 3 parts. So first, we're going to talk about how heritage is gendered. And then we're going to move on to the 2003 convention specifically. And then we're going to talk about some key issues. So heritage is gendered. What does this mean? Well, heritage is gendered in several ways. And in a very fundamental way, heritage is gendered in the sense that the discourse, the heritage discourse itself is gendered, which also means that the heritage protection system is also often gendered. So let me just give you an example of what this might mean. So I'm going to be using an example from my home country of Sweden. So outside of the capital of Stockholm, there's this island where there was or is a Viking Age settlement called Birka. And here, you found lots of various graves, of course, but especially one grave in particular has become quite famous. So we have this warrior grave, which was excavated in the 19th century. And among the grave goods, you found various weapons, a board game placed in this person's lap, gaming pieces, and 2 horses. So from this, you deem that this person was a very high status warrior or even a commander, judging from the game pieces. And this person became quite the archetype of a Viking Age high status warrior. So there was lots of ideas about who this person was or what kind of function and status they enjoyed in society. And at this time, the methodology used for establishing the sex was an archaeological sex determination method, meaning that you looked at the grave goods, and from the grave goods you could decide if the person was a man or a woman. So this person was a man for decades. But in 2017, through a different research project, a DNA analysis was conducted of the bones, and then you found out that this individual was in fact a woman. And this finding caused quite a stir, actually, and it made some headlines also internationally, which is very interesting, of course. Because it also says something of how in the time of the kind of interpretation that we include. So let me just first of all, so in this archaeological sex determination method, in this case, the type of logic that was used was something like this. So you had a circle argument going on, but the thing is that what was first an assumption, after being reiterated and repeated over the years, it becomes an established fact, or it did become an established fact in this case. And so it caused quite a story. And what was interesting, of course, is that you had from earlier all these ideas about what kind of status this person enjoyed in society and what function they had. But when the individual switched gender, all of a sudden, it was hard to apply the same theories on the grave, which is interesting, of course, and perhaps tells us something more about us and our present day view rather than the actual past. So the interpretation is happening very much in the present and is influenced by present day society. And of course, this also posed some uncomfortable questions, for example, about what to do about other graves where the same methodology had been used, and if it also was cause to reassess other already established facts. Anyway, so that was just an example of how the discourse itself can be gendered. But then heritage can also be overtly gendered, in the sense that gender can be a factor directly affecting access and participation. And we can also see in the World Heritage Convention, for example, that we have at least 3 sites where women are forbidden to enter the heritage site. But of course, in the world of ICH, we all know that it's very common that tradition have gender-specific roles. And in some cases, we can also see that we have gender-specific rules and outright restrictions. And we can also find such examples on the representative list of the 2003 convention. And one such example is Kabuki theater, where all the roles are played by male actors, including the female roles. So there are men specializing in in playing female roles called the onagata. And then the festivals, the float festivals that I mentioned earlier, they're also inscribed on the representative list. So women are, in many of the festivals, women are unable to ride the floats, but also unable to touch the floats in order to not pollute the floats as they are sacred. And in perhaps the most famous float festival in Kyoto, the Kyoto Gion Festival, there's this famous sacred child, the Chigo. And this sacred child, this boy, he is not allowed to touch the ground during the festival. So he has to be carried when he's not riding on top of the clothes in order to avoid pollution. And also in the days leading up to the festival, he is not allowed to eat any food that has been touched by a woman's hand. Also, again, in order to avoid pollution. So we can see that ICH and gender are connected and they are interconnected. So they affect one another. So there's an interaction going on between ICH and gender. And the traditional practices play a part in reiterating, validating, and renegotiating gender roles and gender norms. And as such, we can see this interactive relationship as gender, as we have seen, affects a person's access to and participation in heritage practices, while the traditional practices in their turn uphold and validate the gender norms. But of course, at the same time, both gender and heritage are dynamic constructs, constantly being recreated and reshaped. And here we are reminded of the words of Farida Shahid, the former UN Special Reporter on Cultural Rights. And she observed that gender-specific restrictions and practices do not stop at heritage sites. So what does this mean? For example, we can imagine a ritual where certain knowledge is passed on. And so in this case, if you cannot participate in the ritual, you will not be able to acquire that knowledge. So having access to participation can in such ways affect professional opportunities, and also it can mean building networks that will help you in various stages of life, and also in the sense of building self-esteem and confidence, etc. As such, being unable to participate can similarly affect your opportunities in life, but in a negative way. So this, of course, leads to the question, are gender-exclusive practices always discriminatory? And this is a very important and also very difficult question. Can gender restrictions within heritage practices sometimes be seen as acceptable? Or are all female or all male practices always discriminatory? So pertaining to the 2003 convention, Janet Blake has written that all female or all male practices are not necessarily discriminatory, but it's worth considering the implications more fully. And to get back to Farida Shahid, in an interview in World Heritage magazine, she was asked about her view on heritage sites with the restricted access to either men or women, and whether this was compatible with human rights or not. And she replied that while most heritage sites have gender dimensions of access, as she called it, more research is needed on the origin as well as the meaning of the roles and the space that are ascribed to men and women. Nevertheless, it was important to consider the consequences such practices might have in upholding stereotypes and discrimination. And she writes that such practices need revisiting in the light of contemporary realities and international human rights standards. For this, internal discourses are needed within communities using human rights standards as a reference point. And I would like to argue that traditions often reflect the social structures of the present, and perhaps more than the past, our traditions tell us something about the present. In my PhD, I argued that the festivals can be seen as miniature societies, where attitudes, social structures, and movements within the larger society can be seen reflected. And of course, communities are different, and within those communities, there are different voices. So just to give you an example, in my PhD research, I could see that in some festivals, in some cases, it seemed that the festivals were pockets of the old world or images thereof in a changing society. So in one location, the festival world was regarded as different from everyday society. And my informants told me about how the climate in the schools had changed, that the schools nowadays operated on a basic ideology of equality. The float society, on the other hand, was strictly hierarchical. So the people in the top positions decide the rules, and the rules are strictly followed. And the hierarchical structure of the festival society, therefore, offered the children a kind of education in societal studies that they would not have been able to receive in school, according to my informants. And in this location, it seemed that there was an active effort to resist change. And my informants told me that it was the responsibility to not only keep the festival alive for future generations, but also to keep it unchanged. And perhaps especially telling was how one of my informants told me that he did not mind having women in top political positions, for example. So he wouldn't mind having a female prime minister. But the festival floats were off limits. On the other hand, other festival societies seemed positive to change and even eager to adopt to the new world. And my informant in another location told me how the decision to start allowing both girls and boys to perform as musicians was a decision based on a will to strive for more gender equality. So the float organization chose to seize the old custom of female prohibition because it could not be justified in today's society. And my informant also emphasized how he thought that it didn't make any sense to prohibit women from a religious viewpoint. So in both of these cases, you have the festival communities reacting to present-day society. Another point I would like to bring up here is the reasons given for excluding women. So in some cases, it was religion. In other cases, tradition was quoted as the reason for excluding women. In some festivals, the reasons were practical, such as, for example, the floats being too heavy for women to move. In one festival, the burden of responsibility was quoted as the reason. So the argument was that in case, for example, an accident happens, it is the person, it's the people in the top positions, the float officers, that carry the responsibility, and as such, these positions, the top festival officer positions, were deemed as too heavy of a burden for women to carry. But we can also note that at the same time, the burden of responsibility in the domestic sphere was easily entrusted to women. So here there was a division between the public sphere and the domestic sphere. So here we are reminded of Shahid's observation that gender discrimination is often defended by explaining them in terms of culture, religion, and tradition. And she says that it seems safe to conclude that no social group has suffered greater violation of human rights in the name of culture than women. So the transgressions against some social group appear to be harder to label as discrimination than others. So when it comes to the social group of women, it's often the case that discriminatory practices are accepted and excused in the name of culture, religion, and tradition. So let's move on to talk about the 2003 Convention specifically. And before we start, let's just note that gender is a very sensitive issue, and as such, it's often easier to avoid than to address. And we can see this also in how the gender has been handled through the history of the convention. And I can also mention that I myself have been advised many times to change my research topic, because it's just too difficult. It's better to leave it untouched. So let's start with the definition of ICH, and you know this, of course. So the definition is quite wide and also includes a set of criteria. as you know. And I usually refer to this criteria as the goodness criteria. So in order to be recognized as intangible cultural heritage, according to this convention, ICH must be compatible with international human rights instruments, requirements of mutual respect among communities, groups, and individuals, and requirements of sustainable development. So what does this mean in practice? And this is, of course, the hard question. In theory, this should mean that discriminatory practices should not be included on any of the lists of the convention. In practice, though, there is no clearly defined line separating what is to be deemed as acceptable and what is not. And perhaps especially when it comes to gender, it seems to be a very delicate issue to establish what this criteria should entail. And in 2013, UNESCO presented an evaluation that had been done of the convention thus far. And lots of various topics or items were addressed in this evaluation. And one of them was gender, and it was noted that gender equality, gender equality was named as was described as the elephant in the room, meaning that gender equality was a topic that everyone is aware of, but no one wants to talk about it. So the evaluation found that it was problematic to integrate gender equality into the mechanism on the convention, and that the convention lacked guidance and tools of how to address and handle this matter. And as such, that the convention had thus far been gender blind. And it was also mused that part of the reason, at least, why was that there was a fear or a nervousness among state parties, but also other stakeholders, of what would happen to the already listed elements if these rules, the goodness criteria, were to be strictly followed. And let me just briefly also note here that in this convention, cultural heritage is treated as something only positive. So we can compare this to the World Heritage Convention, for example, where so-called negative or difficult or painful heritage is also acknowledged. But the 2003 convention has this set of goodness criteria, so only good traditions are covered by this convention. And on that note, let me also just mention that here we can see a difference between documenting a tradition and encouraging a tradition, of course. So there's a distinction to be made between, for example, recording information about a tradition and taking action to uphold the continuity of that tradition. But in this convention, the focus is on the continuity of the tradition. So the traditions should live on. Okay, so let's just look briefly at how gender has been handled within the convention so far. So I made a simple analysis just of the summary records and other documents from general assemblies and committee meetings. So in the first years, we can see that gender is not mentioned. And then in 2011, the consultative body reports being struck by the invisibility of women. And then in 2013, we can notice an increased focus on gender. And this is also the year when the evaluation that I just mentioned was presented. So this evaluation brought about a plan of action to revise all the relevant forms of the convention, including operational directives, periodic reports, formats, and the nomination files. So this was done in the following years, and there was also some new materials developed. And well, these are some of the materials that has been revised and developed. And the last year, we can note that the information sheet on gender equality was made available online. So just to sum up a bit here, so gender within ICH is a sensitive and delicate issue, and that's why it's easier to avoid and to address, because here we have a potential conflict of interest between the freedom of discrimination and the protection of tradition. So this poses some uncomfortable questions. So it forces a discussion on the question, what constitutes discrimination? And also, is there a difference between social labels when it comes to defining discrimination? And we can also imagine both when it comes to including gender in the tools of the convention. We can imagine both benefits as well as potential downsides in mandating an inclusion of gender in the descriptions. So is there a risk that the description might be used as an argument to keep restrictions in place for the sake of the preservation of the tradition? For example, imagine that you have a festival that has until recently, or still is, performed by mainly men, but now you have a new generation of women and girls who are eager to participate, and the community is very positive to this. In such a case, can this official description, let's say the official description says that is primarily a male tradition. In this case, if there were some people who were resistant to letting women participate, could this official description then be used as an argument for not allowing female participation, lest it jeopardizes the authenticity of the tradition? And then there's also the risk of sanitizing the tradition in the description to fit with UNESCO policies. And we'll get back to that later. On the upside, you have the availability of data, which enables gender analysis, which is of course important. But one might also question the veracity of that data in some cases, as there might be a small or a big gap between the realities on the ground and the image that the state party has chosen to project in the description, in the nomination file. You also have the possibility of the addressing of gender encouraging discussion and reflection, and possibly a mitigation of the existing rules. But then we also have to ask, of course, is it desirable that the traditions are altered to fit with UNESCO policies? Is that in line with the goals of the convention? So looking at gender in the elements of the representative lists, there are a lot of factors to look at if you're wanting to make a gender analysis, for example, of the elements on the list. So what categories do you use? We have gender exclusive practices, which are performed by only one gender. Then we have shared practices, and some of them with gender-specific roles. So you can have you have several traditions where men and women perform together, but in separate roles. Then, of course, you have gender-neutral practices as well. But then there is also different levels of strictness in the rules. So sometimes these gender rules can be tendencies, and in other cases there might be outright restrictions. Then you also have gender-coded roles. And then, of course, you have gendered domains and also differences in attributed value. Then you have the question of who is doing the inventorying and who is being asked in this inventorying process. And so how to measure gender equality in ICH in this case, if doing a gender analysis of the representative list, for example. What do you measure exactly? Is it the access to participation that is important, or is it the actual participation? Or is it representation in the form of membership in the formal organization, for example? So let's have a look at some gender analysis that have been made of the elements on the representative list. So let's mention Vanessa Whittington's gender analysis. And she looked at elements inscribed during 5 years. And she found that there was a male dominance, meaning that there were more male practices than female practices. And I also made a simple analysis of the only the Japanese inscribed elements as well, and found the same tendency. So here we're also reminded of the consultative body reporting being struck by the invisibility of women, as mentioned earlier in 2011. So Whittington, she found a male dominance, and she also found that there were many shared practices. And also in many of these shared practices, women and men were performing together, but in gender prescribed roles. And she found that it was often the case that female roles were attributed less value, or value based on characteristics not applied to men within that cultural context, such as beauty or skill as a housewife. And in my analysis of the Japanese elements, I could also see a similar tendency where male roles were sometimes described, or often described, in terms of skill or prowess, and female roles were often described in terms of appearances and what costumes they were wearing and so on. Whittington also noted that there were gender domains where female practices were often associated with the domestic sphere, for example, pertaining to food preparation and home-based handicraft, whereas male practices often took place in the public domain. And she also found that it was not uncommon that formerly male exclusive practices had opened up for female participation. And one part here that was interesting was that she also found that, she writes that within this discourse, women are given particular responsibility for maintaining existing social practices and gender relations, and thereby ensuring a form of community cohesion, potentially based on their own subordination. So here we are reminded of Bourdieu's ideas on symbolic violence, also, which is also an interesting aspect to apply to this, if you're inclined to. Then let's also mention the Seribasic analysis of gender analysis of the elements on the representative list. And she found, well, as the nomination forms were updated to include gender, this was of course reflected in the nominations. And when state parties were asked to include gender, she found that there was sometimes an overemphasis on women's centrality. And she also found that phrases such as gender neutral or regardless of gender was often used, but it was perhaps not always corresponding to the situation on the ground. So here we had some sanitization going on. So this poses a question, of course, of why then, in that case, if there are more male practices than female practices inscribed on the list, then why is that? Why are men more visible than women on the list? Is it because the heritage protection system is in itself gendered? Is there a gender factor in what types of traditions are being classified as valuable? then there is also the question of who is making the inventories. And is it because there is often a gender division between the public and the domestic domains, where the domestic practices are less visible or less accessible? And I'm touching upon these questions in my current research, so hopefully I will be able to get back to you someday. And let's also just briefly mention here that, of course, there are very different approaches between different state parties. And as you know, I'm sure, the state parties are free to conduct or to create the national inventories in any way they see fit for the conditions of that country. So of course we can see some different approaches here, and it's interesting to look at different national inventories. So sometimes we can find some very top-down approaches and also some bottom-up approaches. And let me just give you an example of a bottom-up approach. So let's look at Finland briefly. So the Finnish national inventory is in the form of a wiki, where anyone can make contributions to this inventory, or at least submit proposals. And in the guidelines for how to submit proposals, it's written that when making your proposal, you should show consideration for the diversity, variation, and nuances of traditions. And what's really interesting is that it's possible to make several submissions for the same element from different perspectives. So this says that in this case, there is an awareness that traditions can mean different things for different people, and there is not one right way of doing it. In the guideline, it also says that you should show consideration for previously underrepresented groups and avoid stereotypical assumptions. So there is also a layer of gender awareness here that we can see visible. And let's also talk a bit about what listing heritage means and what listing heritage does. In the 2003 convention, there's a big focus on the representative list. And Hafstein quotes that in the 2003 convention, ICH is a list. And we should be aware that there is a gap between the description of a local practice and what is actually taking place on the ground. And by the time that a practice ends up as an element inscribed on a UNESCO list, that gap has become quite wide. Also, we should keep in mind that the people engaging in that tradition are individuals with their own agency. Nonetheless, communities are often seen as homogeneous groups, and traditions are often seen as things carried by bearers, instead of seeing it as people choosing to perform a tradition, and that is how it exists. So there's, as I just mentioned, there's a big focus on particularly the representative list. And here we should keep in mind, of course, that on this list, state parties are projecting an image on the international arena. And here it's also relevant to note that new nominations are evaluated based only on the information provided in the nomination file, which emphasizes the importance of the official description in the nomination file. Well, however, this might or might not change in the future. And currently, there is a review or evaluation or assessment going on of the listing mechanism of the convention. And in this, one of the items being scrutinized is the evaluation methodology. So earlier this year, I think there was a category 6 expert meeting, and now I think there's an open-ended intergovernmental working group working on this. In this meeting, this limitation was identified as a difficulty, and a majority of the experts agree that the evaluation body should have the ability to consult information outside of the file. And it was furthermore suggested that this option should primarily be used when there is strong evidence that the information in the file is inaccurate or contradictory. So here we have to ask, of course, what effects do the listing and the inventorying have, and what effects does it have on gender dynamics? How does the description affect the practice and the practitioners? Is it a pure form of the practice being essentialized? And is there any room for change? Are restrictions validated, or are tendencies transformed into rules? And can the descriptions be used as an argument to keep restrictions in place for the sake of the preservation of the tradition? That is, as an argument for authenticity. So let's move on here to part 3 and talk about some key issues. And first up, let's talk a bit about discrimination. So this is one of the big problem areas, of course, or this is a very problematic matter, of course. So when it comes to ICH, there is a potential conflict of interest between the preservation of traditional practices and the assurance of freedom from discrimination. So the question here is, what level of, for example, gender-based rules can be seen as acceptable and what cannot? And so what is discrimination in the realm of ICH? So where do you draw the line between what can be seen as acceptable and what cannot? And part of how you answer that question might depend on the underlying view of human rights at play. So we can mention here two clashing approaches to human rights. So we have the universalist view and the cultural relativist view. And in the universalist approach to human rights are always valid for everyone, regardless of circumstances. In the cultural relativist approach to human rights, consideration needs to be taken of the cultural circumstances, since different societies will have different cultural norms, values, and codes. So you have to look at the local context. So one question here is, of course, what approach does the 2003 convention take? And I would say it's still somewhat of an open question and an unsolved problem. And related to this is also the tension between human rights and cultural rights. Where human rights are individual, cultural rights are often seen as collective. So in cultural rights, you often find a focus on the rights of minority groups in a majority society, with the right to keep their cultural practices. So this can be about language, but it can also be about customs, such as polygamy, for example. And sometimes there can be a conflict between those practices and the enjoyment of fundamental freedoms of the individual. So sometimes you have a cultural practice anchored in a patriarchal tradition, impeding on the human rights of women. So, and against this background, Okin poses the question, is multiculturalism bad for women? And in this article, or in this research, it was later published as a book. She discusses the problems connected to treating culture as a valid reason for allowing some groups special permission for engaging in behaviors that would otherwise be seen as unacceptable, especially without paying enough heed to the interest of all the stakeholders involved, including the often silenced ones. And Thomas Hylland Eriksen puts an emphasis on the rights of the individual and argues that multiculturalist policies have to be universalistic in their very nature, saying that culture is not a legitimating basis for political claims. And cultural singularities among minorities and majorities in modern societies can only be defended to the extent that they do not interfere with individual human rights. So Eriksen places an emphasis on the individual and argues for a version of multiculturalism where the power to define cultural heritage is decentralized, with room for individualistic thinking about personhood. So a person has a freedom in defining their cultural identities and also a plethora of identity options. And Eriksen argues that such an interpretation of multiculturalism, critical multiculturalism, may enable diverse groups to participate in the public life with their cultural heritage or cultural identity as their legitimated symbolic capital. And that this can be liberating for previously or commonly silenced groups, such as, for example, women. And so the individual's freedom to identity and to define their own culture is important here. And Eriksen writes that if, on the other hand, institutionalized differences form the core of multiculturalist practices, it's liable to regress into nihilism, apartheid, and or the enforced ascription of cultural identities. So one point in question here is, of course, how do you define discrimination? And so there are various definitions of discrimination, since in this case we're dealing with ICS and gender, so let's have a look at how discrimination is defined in another convention, namely the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And first of all, we can note that this convention has been ratified by 189 state parties. And in this convention, discrimination of women is defined as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. And in this convention, state parties undertake to take appropriate measures to modify and abolish existing laws, regulations, customs, and practices which constitute discrimination against women. And state parties shall also take appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudice and customary and all other practices which are based on the idea of inferiority or the superiority of either of the sexes, or on stereotyped roles for men and women. So we can see that according to the definition of discrimination in this convention, quite a lot of traditional practices can be deemed as discriminatory. However, here we can also remember Shahid's observation that when it comes to discrimination of women, it's often defended by explaining it in terms of culture, religion, or tradition, and that this is this is very naturalized, let's say. So let's also talk a bit about the terms of sex, gender, and also mention gender-coded roles. So the terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably, and both these terms are also often used, or are also often seen as binary. And this is also very visible in the 2003 convention. So one might argue that there is no real consideration shown for bodily spectrums or gender plurality, fluidity, or range zones. And well, this is a bit of a messy topic, really. And in many traditional practices, we find gender-determined roles and tasks, and sometimes we can find that these roles and tasks have bodily criteria. So a certain type of body is required to do the task. For example, in the float festivals, the floats were so heavy, so great muscle strength is needed in order to move them. And sometimes we have cultural criteria. For example, that the floats are sacred and must be protected from pollution, and therefore only men can touch them. And then, in many practices, we can find gender-coded roles. And the gender of the role may or may not coincide with the gender of the person performing the role. So what does this mean in terms of access to participation? And just let us look at some examples. So in Japan, you can find various rituals pertaining to rice cultivation. And in some of these rituals, or in many of these rice cultivation rituals, you have the role of saotome. And saotome is often translated into rice maiden. So this is a gender-coded role, and the role in itself is coded as female. It's the rice maiden. However, the practitioners can be either men or women. So in some locations, the role of saotome is performed by men, and in others, it's performed by women. But even when men are performing the role of the rice maiden, the coding is still female. And in this tradition, the gender coding itself is relevant because there is also a sexual meaning in this ritual. So we have the meeting between the rice maiden and the deity of the rice field, and enabling the fertilization of the earth. So in this tradition, the gender coding is relevant. And another example, I would like to mention the Lucia tradition in Sweden, for example. So in wintertime, in December in Sweden, if you go to a school, you will find a lot of Lucia celebrations happening. So here we have a procession of usually children, but sometimes adults do this too. But you have this group of people dressing up in these white costumes and carrying candlelight. And they walk in a procession and sing songs and perform songs in front of the audience. And then afterwards, everyone have hot chocolate together. And when I was growing up in Sweden, this was well, a very alive custom, of course, and the role of Lucia was very popular. So all the girls in class wanted to be Lucia, but only one person could perform in this role. So all the other girls had to settle for the other secondary roles, and the boys had to settle for boys' roles. So in each school class, for example, you had the students voted on who got to be Lucia. And not only in schools, but also you had the town Lucia or city Lucia and so on. So people voted on who would become Lucia. And this came to resemble almost like a beauty pageant. And as such, it also gained it also drew a lot of criticism. And now this custom of voting for Lucia has disappeared. And also the gender restrictions are gone nowadays. I can also mention that also the restrictions of number is gone. So if you go to a school in Sweden now and watch a Lucia procession, you can find a whole class of Lucias. And also you have a bunch of new roles appearing as well. Anyway, this role of Lucia is also gender coded. So this is a female role, and Lucia was a historical figure. She was a saint in Italy, and she was killed by a sword, according to the legend, I think. And so the red band that she wears around her waist represents the blood dripping down her body. So this is a gender coded role, a female coded role. But I would argue that the gender coding is losing its relevance in this case, because the gender coding itself is not viewed as important anymore in this tradition. It's not an important aspect of the tradition in itself. And then let's also talk a little bit about queer dance. So in lots of couples dances, where you usually have one woman dancing with one man in a couples dance, you also, of course, have queer versions of that same dance. And so queer versions of tango, salsa, or whatever couple dances can be found in lots of places, and are also growing or gaining popularity, I believe. And but in this case, let's not go into the origin of dances itself, but because those circumstances and the rules might have looked quite different. Anyway, so we have nowadays quite a few queer tango clubs, for example. And here we can also make a distinction between gender-neutral dance and queer dance. Whereas gender-neutral dance has been around for decades, and in the gender-neutral version, you use gender-neutral words. So instead of talking about the woman's role and the man's role, perhaps you might use other terms such as the leader and the follower. And women can dance with women, and men can dance with men, and of course women can dance with men, and so on. So gender is a non-factor, and there's a freedom to dance any role you choose. And also you can switch roles between dances, or also mid-dance. And then we also have queer dance clubs, and this is taking it one step further. So here you're actively questioning the hetero norm. on the dance floor as well as in society. So there's a subversive dimension to it. Okay, so let's move on and talk a little bit about consent. Because as I'm sure you know, when state parties submit nominations for inscription, they are required to include the free, prior, and informed consent of the relevant communities, of the actual stakeholders. And a big question in this is, of course, whose voices are being heard in these consent forms. And here we can also remember, as mentioned earlier, that nominations are evaluated based only on the information provided in the nomination file, or at least thus far. As I mentioned earlier, it might change in the future, or it might not. And in the aforementioned Category 6 expert meeting on the listing mechanism of the convention, the matter of the active participation of the community and the acquisition of consent were pointed out as problem-laden areas, as well as culturally sensitive topics. And it was suggested that it would be useful with a guidance note for obtaining free, prior, and informed consent approach from different cultural perspectives, and particularly non-European ones, as well as guidance on the right measure of community participation and gender balance. So let me yet again use the float festivals as an example to see what this consent form can look like. So the float festivals is a group nomination. So we have 33 festivals nominated or inscribed together as a group. Well, originally you have 2 festivals inscribed individually, but then when the group nomination came about, then these 2 were retracted and included instead in the group nomination. So now you have 33 festivals inscribed together as a group. So in the consent form here you have 67 signatories. So you have the 33 presidents of the preservation associations of those specific festivals, and then you have the 33 mayors of the towns. And we can note here that all 67 signatories are men, but seeing that the preservation associations and the festivals in themselves are male dominated, it's not surprising at all to find that all the signatories are men. But it might be interesting, of course, here to note also that in this case, all the 33 mayors also happen to be men. In any case, what is interesting here to notice that in the nomination, controversies and debates regarding gender restrictions are not mentioned. And this is despite the fact that there have been quite some controversies and debates, also covered by national media. For example, in Kyoto, you had a public panel debate where you were discussing whether to allow female participants or specifically whether to allow women to participate as musicians or not. And then accidentally one of the members of one of the neighborhoods revealed that actually in his neighborhood women had been participating, but in secret for years. So it was like a semi-open secret. So this also caused quite a few headlines. But also in Kyoto, there is a group of women who have created a formal organization and been training as musicians, and they also assembled their own float intended for an all-female music troupe. And they have not yet been able to participate in the main events of the festival. So there has been there are several examples of movements happening, movements propagating and to allow for women to participate, etc., and so on. But none of these controversies or debates are mentioned in the nomination file. Instead, we can note that the nomination file gives a quite inclusive image of the festivals. So the festivals are described in a way that indicates that the whole communities are involved in the festivals, which is interesting, of course. Okay, and let's also talk briefly on the topic of change.
Helga, may I kindly interrupt and even more kindly ask you to try to sum up, because there are some questions, so that we can have some time for discussion, because your presentation is really, really interesting and some of the questions are really, really interesting.
I see.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, okay, definitely, let's do that. So let me just, because I was about to finish anyway, but let's skip change, and before moving on to the discussion session, let me just tell you this, because I know that you're doing an assignment and you are making a description or an action plan for a tradition of your choice. So when assessing the tradition or practice that you have chosen to work with, I encourage you to ask what power structures and what power relations are at play, and whose voices are being heard and not being heard. I also encourage you to think about your own role in this assignment and question what is your underlying agenda, because a description is not neutral. So I encourage you to think about the work that the description will do. So let's move on then to a discussion session. Lovely. So let me just stop sharing then so I can read the questions.
May I coordinate and summarize these questions, because I went through them. So one of the questions is that, just to give them in a different order, because this would help you also address them, has to do with the definition of
sorry, it has to do with
the definition of gender per se. So the question is whether this topic, this issue of gender discrimination, etc., is a contemporary way of thinking, kind of transferred or even imposed on a tradition that I mean dates back some hundreds of years. And just to read that after this framework, considering the fact that gender as an academic, this was addressed by Ahana, considering the fact that gender as an academic and concept was developed in Europe in a post-industrialization period, let's say during the 1930s, should we in the third world consider gender with its etymological history tied with colonialism as the parameter against which to judge our intangible heritage? Of course, we have to critique our traditions and flawed modernity and hold it accountably for its treatment of women. But if a particular intangible heritage with its rich and varied cultural heritage is on the verge of extinction, for example, but holds precious community memory? Should we be harsh on its memory and denounce it for its sexist, patriarchal undertones? So is the kind of, moving in time? This is the first question that is addressed. Let me group some more questions so that you have, because there are some interlinks between the questions. The second question has to do with the relationship between the strength, the power relationship between the gender discrimination issue with the culture, faith, religion rights that you also addressed at your part of your final part of your presentation. This question came before the final part of your presentation. So the question is by Raj Sujal. Fundamental question is whether human rights have classification among themselves in relation to right of to equality and right to culture and faith, religion. Do you think that right to culture, faith, religion is junior to right to equality? And how do you think about giving emphasis on gender in intangible cultural heritage, and whether this would be against fundamental principle of the respect towards the intangible heritage itself? And the third question, just to summarize that also for you, that it regards the boundaries of this sex discrimination issue. Because I mean, we talk a lot, and you presented very nicely the question about female discriminated by male perceptions, etc. What about the third gender? Would one come and say, for example, if the female is already discriminated by male, what happens to the third gender? It's out of the equation, somebody would say. And just to follow up on that, a question from my part that might be connected. For example, robots are coming because of the reference of Harriet at the beginning about the artificial intelligence, etc. When different human beings or a different type of human beings, might say, what about us? There is a lot of discrimination going on, and how can we get into that? Or you might leave this aside. So these are the three key questions. I just group them for your convenience and put them in a different order. The first has to do with the definition, contemporary versus traditional way of thinking. The second has to do with the balance of power, of essence between the different rights, gender issue to religion, faith, etc. And the third has to do with the boundaries of the concept regarding the gender definition itself. Thank you. I addressed all of them because there are some interlinking points as well.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much. And these are all excellent questions. And also very tricky, all of them, of course, which makes them interesting as well. So let's start with the first one. And please, if I kind of lose my way somewhere along the way here, then please remind me also again and get me back on track on the other questions as well. So first, when it comes to the sense of contemporariness and the definition and also human rights being a largely Western concept, or often criticized as a Western concept. So here also, first of all here, there are some various factors in this. First of all, when it comes to there's a distinction to make here between various fields of ICH protection. So you have national, maybe protection systems in some countries covering also ICH, and then you have UNESCO, the UNESCO systems, and then you have the lives of people doing traditions that might or might not be included on any inventory or whatsoever. It's just a living tradition. And in this case, when it comes to the to UNESCO and the representative list, what is being discussed here really is whether this element in question is can be considered as corresponding to the requirements of this convention. So what happens? The question being discussed in this case is whether to inscribe an element on a list or not. So it's not really on the UNESCO level. It's not about forbidding anyone to continue doing their customs or so on. But of course, on the reality of the ground, on the ground, it's a very the questions has a very different dimension to it, of course, because it's about because ICH really connects to identity and really important things. So it's not only about whether something is inscribed or not. But here also, when it comes to human rights, as I mentioned, there are fundamentally two different approaches: the universalist view and the cultural relativist view. So there is this is a still unresolved dilemma, really, how to approach human rights, because the human rights instrument has been criticized for being overly Western and not taking other cultural realities into account. So yeah, how to solve this indeed. And here we can, it really depends on how you, on who you ask, because different people will give you different answers, whether to adhere to the universalist approach or to the cultural relativist approach. So it's a tricky question, but as I mentioned, at least Erickson and Okin, they emphasize the individuality of rights, saying that, so here the point is that that rights can be understood as individual. So you have the right to exercise culture, religion, and your beliefs freely, as long as it doesn't impede on anyone else's individual rights. So something this also
and something about the third gender.
Yes, and so this connects to the second topic, of course, the rights versus rights. And let me just before talking about before moving on to the third gender, yes, let me just also mention here that that specifically because we have the goodness criteria in this convention, it becomes a very tricky topic because exactly we have the goodness criteria. You're only allowed to acknowledge good traditions. which makes it very, very difficult, and it makes it political and very difficult to handle, because it's not about just celebrating heritage or learning about what kind of customs there are in the world and documenting these. It's about keeping them alive, and then you have this goodness criteria, which makes it very, very difficult. Okay, so about the third gender, indeed, is a very, very very important aspect of this, which is not very visible at all, I would say, at least in the mechanism of the convention, at least not as far as I have noted. So often when you talk about gender, you automatically fall back to just these two options of female and male, which is of course not enough at all, and it doesn't reflect the realities in a good way at all. So and it's also a problem when talking about, for example, discrimination of women, of course, that, as you mentioned, that sometimes this might mean that you forget about other gender identities, which kind of fall between chairs and are not recognized. They're out of the equation, as you said, and this is, of course, a problem. But part of the solution might be also to acknowledge gender spectra, let's call it. So if you, in the convention also, if you acknowledge that there are a plethora of genders, and you allow this, and you in the mechanism as well, then maybe that can also inform a way forward, or how to deal with the problem of discrimination. Hopefully, if you acknowledge that the world is not as simple as just dividing it in either female or male, then it might be a big help, a step on the way, I believe.
If we open up the discussion, more details, more depth might
yes.
get that, but
yes,
we need to open the discussion, to open up the discussion.
Yeah, and it would allow for nuances, and it would also allow for the underlying power relations to become more visible, and therefore also perhaps easier to talk about and to change, because it's hard to change something before it's visible.
Another question, in many cases, by Lumna, in many cases, as cultural activists, as cultural activists, we need to convince communities to make a traditional cultural practice like martial art gender inclusive. This often leads to critique of our work as interference with the tradition. What is the academic perspective on that?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's a very good, it's an excellent question.
Allow me to say that all questions are excellent, but all questions are very difficult
yes.
to answer.
yes, indeed. So, and here, of course, we have to also set the scene. Is the question about whether to include something in the inventory of the UNESCO Convention or not? I mean, or the criteria, the goodness criteria, the criteria being followed, or is it more of a moral issue, whether it's right or wrong to continue a gender exclusive tradition or not? Anyway, I think that as a researcher, when approaching ICH and approaching a tradition or practice that might have some problematic areas such as gender restrictions, then I think that we should ask ourselves at least 3 questions. What power relations are at play in this practice? And what's the power structures? And if you have a restriction, what is the purpose of that restrictions? And what is the background of that restrictions? Can it be defended today? Because this also relates to what can be constituted as discrimination also. So the purpose of a restriction is also relevant. For example, if you have some practice, some tradition where you have a group of kids, of girls, where they can perform something together, or allowing a safe space for a group previously excluded from doing something, or a group that traditionally has very little power or very little voice, and to having a group of those people only might allow them a safe space in order to do this. And in such case, there might be it might be easier to accept that there is a restriction, an exclusivity to the group. But if, for example, if the purpose or if the background of a restriction is that female bodies are polluted, for example, that is very hard, of course, to defend today. So the purpose and the background of the restriction itself matter, I would say. And the third thing we should ask ourselves also as researchers is whose voices are being heard, and whose voices are we actively listening to, and other voices which are not being heard in this, and to also talk to those people who are traditionally excluded from some from a certain practice, etc.
Also, to draw the attention, it's not a question, it's a note, but to draw the attention to the note of Harriet based on her personal experience. Also, this is such an important issue. Opening up for discussion about gender diversity is a good idea in theory, but Harriet, has heard from other UNESCO facilitators for the 2003 convention that it is a big hurdle in itself at national level discussions. In a way, Harriet has the impression that the issue it has been easier to, it would be easier to start the discussion on equality of women per se. This was a note, a very interesting note. Is there any last question that somebody would like to address to Helga before we close this very interesting presentation? Helga, indeed. Any last note? Any last comment? Somebody? If there is no, just allow me to mention that many of these issues are still open even in the World Heritage Convention.
Yes, indeed.
They're still open, indeed. And we refer to the issues of a 2003 convention, a very recent convention, while since 1972, many of these issues are, are being discussed, but they have not been resolved in the other convention as well. And also this would be a link, possibly link between the two conventions, because there's many similarities in these issues. And a last question is whether there is any academic article that the participants could refer to.
Oh, yeah, well, there is...
to choose, you mentioned, you refer to many articles, but if somebody would about to take one or two articles on this issue, which one would you, let's say, not prioritizing over the others, but for the benefit of the participants to make it more practical, which, let's say, 1 or 2 articles would you feel, that you could, let's say, recommend?
Yeah.
Also, in the given assignment that they have to write, so you could,
Or
mention...
if I can share my screen again, and perhaps let's see if I can start slide from here.
We can see your slide.
Oh, is it big enough?
Yes, yes, I think we can see that. Yes, we can see
Or
that.
how about now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, so in this case, I would mention Laura Jane Smith, her 2008 article on heritage, gender, and identity. And this is about in the way that the heritage discourse itself is gendered. So it's in a quite a general but very fundamental way. But when it comes to the practical issues in particular, if I have to choose two, yeah, it's such a tricky question, of course.
And may I suggest one of your own papers, Helga, the one of 2020, the two of 2020. Okay, so we keep this as well.
Yeah, right. Well, in my PhD, I'm discussing all of this, of course. But I can also recommend Eriksen's article from 1997, but that is about multiculturalism specifically. So it's hard, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's very hard to find research on this
to make
topic.
it easier for you, Helga, if I may suggest that if you could send us some publication out of your PhD research, that would be wonderful, I think. And I agree, Laura Jane Smith. So what we would like to do is we could share with the participants so they have a reference and they could incorporate it in the assignment as well.
Yes,
so
absolutely. That's an excellent suggestion.
Helga, thank you, everybody. Back to Barbie. Barbie, please proceed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Helga, for this wonderful presentation. I think all of us are very much intrigued by the whole dynamics that you mentioned. Just one last announcement. I got a lot of requests asking for the presentations of the lecturers. We will be writing to all the lecturers about their presentations if they are comfortable sharing them. And at the end of the workshop, we will be compiling them into a booklet, which we'll be sharing with you. So just hang on till then and we'll get back to you. In case there are any other further queries, please do write to me and I'll get back to you about them as well.